I'm very happy to be here, not only because it's so beautiful here and sunny and warm as opposed to what I had in New York a few days ago, but also because I really view the work of the Center for Social Innovation here run by Gary as one of the leading actors in that space of social innovation, which is a space that I really care a lot about. And so I'm very happy to be with you here today. I confirm that I'd be very happy for you to interrupt in any ways, either because you have questions or because you feel that some of the elements that I'll bring up are not clear. The presentation that I will do today is work that actually stems from my dissertation work. So that's work that I conducted a few years ago that has been put on hold for a little while because of administrative responsibility that I had back in my school, and that I'm going back to with a lot of excitement. Now really aiming to ultimately publish that work that I'm now conducting together with Julie Batilana and Channing Spencer at Harvard Business School. Before I dive into this paper, I'd like to give a little bit of background about where that research came from. And what I have to say is that although I'm now a professor at ESSEC Business School, an academic institution in France, I started my professional career as a practitioner. I was part of the founding team of an organization called Unis-Cité, which launched in France this idea of youth service. And so I've been very much involved in an organization that very much viewed itself as a social innovation organization, introducing in a context like France this idea of youth service. And we did many things through this organization, and one thing that puzzled me was that when I was sitting on the board of this organization, I was always puzzled by the fact that we had on this board different people with different backgrounds and profiles, and we often engaged in very heated discussion about how should we run operations, how should we go to scale, how should we do lobbying. And what was obvious was that the different profile that different people had on the board very much drove the way in which they viewed things, and sometimes led us to focus on issues that were not necessarily fully addressing our mission, but which were really driven by somehow the world views that people on the board brought to the table, and at times distracted the work of the board. And so that stayed with me. I'm still involved on the board of this organization, and that is still happening, and that is still puzzling me. And so when I got a chance during my dissertation to really deep dive into other organizations, I didn't use my own organization as the content, but I was very much interested in trying to understand how organizations that are aiming at pursuing a social mission while relying on commercial or entrepreneurial approaches to do so, were able to keep their eyes on the goals that they were pursuing without being distracted by other things. And so this is a bit of the, let's say, background for this research. Overall, the topic that I'm interested in and that this research reflects is this notion of hybrid organizations. So hybrid organizations, they can be found in many different sectors, and they are characterized by this idea of bringing together worlds that used to be separated. So you have public-private partnerships to produce energy, you have community banks, you have biotech firms, you have microfinance institutions. These are all examples of these organizational forms that somehow try to bring together two worlds. And on a more theoretical dimension, if we try to define what these organizations are about, we can describe them as organizations that combine multiple logics in an enduring fashion. And what I mean by logics or institutional logics is this idea, this notion of socially constructed means, ends, prescriptions that define appropriate behavior in a given field. So before entering the academic field, I used to refer to this as, ideologies that people had, or you could call them worldviews if you wanted to use a more, common term. It's really the way in which people, shaped by their upbringing, by their experience, by their training, by their professional experience, end up viewing the world as this is how things should be done because this is how things are appropriate. And depending on whether you're a business school graduate and have worked in the business sector for your whole career, or whether you've been trained as a social worker and worked in a social organization for your whole life, the way in which you view the world will be different, and in many ways this becomes taken for granted. So this is what I will refer to as this institutional logics for the rest of my talks. And so, these institutional logics, they define, what an organization should do, but also how an organization should operate to achieve that goal. And so when you have hybrid organizations that combine these multiple logics, you also have these organizations that then, embrace multiple and potentially conflicting goals. And this puts them in a very specific position. And so if we look at the, hybrid organizations have been existing for a long time. What we see yet is that they're becoming more and more prevalent. And the reason why it is so is that, people view these organizations as a very promising way to organize because somehow they enable to bring the best of two worlds. So bringing the best of the public and the private sector in public-private partnerships, bringing the best of the social and the business world in social enterprises. And so they're viewed as very promising. Yet it's also quite obvious now from what research tells us is that they are also facing very difficult challenges. So they experience potentially intense conflicts. They find it very difficult to be sustainable because somehow they're relying on different profiles of resources to in their business models. And so over time we also know that although these are organizations with potential great impact, they're also potentially more likely to face these difficult tensions that may end up threatening their sustainability. And one specific puzzle that we are interested in the context of that work is understanding how they are able to maintain their attention on multiple goals. As we've mentioned, these are organizations that pursue potentially at least two, let's say two to be easier, it could be even more than that, so pursue multiple goals. And what is key for them to succeed at achieving these multiple goals is for them to maintain their attention on the two goals. And I mean by that, that decision makers in these organizations are able to maintain their attention on two goals. And what we also know is that the attention of decision maker in organizations is in part driven by adhesion to institutional logic. So logic somehow, someone who is identified with a given logic is likely to pay attention to the issues and to the goals that have been defined as important and legitimate in a given logic. And so, in a context of an organization that has two goals that mixes these two logics, very important questions become, how can these organizations make sure that they keep their eyes on the two goals without neglecting one or the other? And what we argue here in that research is that that challenge is particularly acute for social enterprises. Because social enterprises that blend the social welfare logic with the commercial logic, and you have here a few examples of such organizations, faced a specific situation where there are potential trade-offs between achieving a social goal and achieving a commercial goal. If they focus all of their attention on the social mission, it is likely that then they will find it difficult to become financially sustainable. Yet, if they end up paying a lot of attention to being financially sustainable, then they may forget about their social mission and engage in what is now widely known in the not-for-profit sector as mission drift. And so the question really becomes, how can hybrid organization in general and social enterprises more specifically maintain their attention on the pursuit of both social and commercial goal? And this is really the puzzle that we are trying to address in the context of that research.
Are you primarily interested in those social enterprises that are actually organized formally as for-profit, either corporations or individual sole proprietorships, or are you also interested in those that are within nonprofit organizations?
As you will see, I'm interested in both. And in my sample, I purposefully selected organizations from these two spaces, and we'll be able to discuss at the end whether it has an impact or not. And so to answer this question, what we did was conduct that comparative case study in the field of work integration social enterprises. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with that space. So work integration social enterprises are organizations that pursue as primary mission the goal to help long-term unemployed people reintegrate the traditional job market. And these organizations do so by hiring them to produce goods and services. It can be catering, it can be recycling, it can be gardening, it can be many different things, with the goal really to help long-term unemployed people relearn the skills of work, deal with some of their health or administrative issues, and reacquire the skills that they need to succeed in a job where they will be able to land after their stay in the WISE. These WISE, they hire these long-term unemployed people for 2 years maximum, and they select the people that they recruit among a specific pool of people that have been identified by the French National Agency for Employment as really requiring specific support and investment because they haven't been working for a very long time, or because they have very low skills, or because they're suffering from illiteracy, or they're suffering from addictions, etc. So what is very interesting for these organizations, and this is why this is the criteria that we used back to Gary's point, we're not very concerned about their legal status, but what we feel is very interested in this organization is that 80% of their revenues come from sales. 20% of their revenues come from subsidies and grants. And what this means is that if these organizations want to survive, they need to be very serious about being full-fledged commercial organizations able to sell their products and services on the market, competing with traditional for-profit non-social organizations. Yet, they do that with a clear goal, ultimate goal, which is the reintegration on the job market of these long-term unemployed. I'm not going to bore you with the details of the French regulatory environment, but these organizations can get an accreditation from the French state to operate as such, and get, as a result, a subsidy to compensate for the lower productivity of these people, which takes the form of a 10,000 euros subsidy per social employee hired. And this is what leads to this 20% of revenues coming from subsidies. So the first work integration social enterprises were created in the late 70s, really as social innovation, entrepreneurial innovation, initiatives led mostly by social workers who were very frustrated by the fact that, they were taking on these people who had, many social difficulties, but they realized actually work is the issue, but work is really difficult for them to find because they don't have the skills to do so, and regular companies will not hire them. And so these people said, you know what, I'm going to create the companies that are going to hire these people. And so you had a few of these initiatives spread across France that at some point realized that there were a few of them that got together, that worked to lobby various governments, and that were successful in leading to the creation of a national-wide policy that is now in place, that Macron has been saying that he will continue to support for now, and that has had a lot of success in really addressing the needs of a very specific profile of people who find it very, very difficult to get back to the job market. So this is a very interesting field because it's a rather large one. There are more than 1,000 such organizations across France. It's not specific to France. In different forms and shapes, that model exists all across the world. And they're really, to me, interesting and exemplar, hybrid social enterprises to the extent that they really have this combination of a clear social mission and a clear need to be really commercial if they want to survive as organizations and have the impact that they wish to have. So, just to make you feel what this may be about, this is a typical day in a WISE. This one is called Juratterie. And so here you have the production activities that the social employees, here are what you would call the beneficiaries, these long-term unemployed people. So here they're working on a recycling line, and here that's also recycling activities. And so that's part of what these social employees do. But they also do, during the day, their days of work, activities related to either training or social mentoring, addressing housing issues, health issues, addiction issues. And so they really engage in these two types of activities, production and social support, which also internally creates these interesting tensions because you have here production supervisors pushing to have as many people as possible to make sure that the commercial work is done, when you have here social workers who work with the employees on this side also pushing to have as much time as possible from the beneficiaries because they want them to get training, to get social support, to get help in finding jobs upon graduation. And so that duality in goals trickles down into day-to-day operations because this is really two different types of activities that are required for the organization to do its job. And if you're interested in how this organization may resolve this tension, we have a paper with Julie Batilana again, published in AMJ in 2015, that looks at how the organizations manage to deal with these operational tensions. In that work that we are doing now, we are much more focusing at the strategic level, the governance level, to try to see how these two goals play out at the decision-making level. So we studied 8 work integration social enterprises in 2 different industries, recycling and temp work. And to Gary's point, we made sure in each of the industry to identify 2 organizations operating technically as a not-for-profit and 2 operating as a for-profit, knowing that the for-profit organizations, because they were all accredited as such by the French state, affirmed that their main mission was really to reintegrate these long-term people on the job market. So they were not in there because their main goal was profit, their main goal was really social, yet they used the for-profit vehicle to do so. We have smaller single-site and larger multi-site organizations, and here you have their age. So they were created in the early 90s, or even one was created a bit earlier. And you have here the number of employees that they have and the total resources that they have. And so we were interested in looking at how in these 8 organizations they were able to cope with that issue of having to pursue these 2 goals and maintaining their attention on these 2 goals. a few words about these two logics that I was referring to before. So what we argue is that these organizations, they are embedded in that space where they're influenced by the social welfare logic as well as the commercial logic. The social welfare logic defines as primary goal addressing local social needs. And usually actors in that space consider that the best way to do so is by using a not-for-profit legal status, which will be owned under the regulation in France for French associations, which is the traditional legal status for not-for-profit, is this idea that people who own the organization are people who care about the mission. It has nothing to do with how much money you put in it, or how wealthy you are, or even how competent you are. It's really about whether or not you care about the mission. Again, a not-for-profit legal status in France is driven by this notion of democratic governance, where people participate in the decision-making process. And in terms of production, there's this idea that you need to adapt whatever you do to the local needs. The commercial logic rests on very different pillars, with this notion of, okay, the goal is to generate and redistribute profits. What is considered as the most efficient way to do so is to use a for-profit legal status owned by shareholders. So ownership is tied to the number of shares that you own, with this idea of a hierarchical model of control and centralization, and this idea that consistency in goods and services is important to generate efficiencies of scale and market the production. And so what's interesting is that these 8 organizations that we study, as the 1,000 else that exist in that space, are somehow embedded in these two different logics. And it's interesting to see, and that's what we're trying to do in this paper, how they are actually managing this competing demands for attention.
You had mentioned that the state both certifies a social enterprise and also for this particular area, the WISE provides $10,000 per worker.
Yeah.
How does philanthropy engage with WISEs? Because you also mentioned that some of the revenue comes from subsidies.
Yeah. So we have quite a few corporate foundations, for instance, that have supported some of these initiatives on a one-off basis. Usually depending on the willingness and ability of the leaders of these WISEs to actually, go out and convince corporations that they are worthwhile activity to invest in. So philanthropy is present. The ethos of these organizations is mainly to say we are real companies, and our primary resources are really coming from the products that we sell on the market. Yet, at times, to fund, for instance, the training activities that they implement, or if they were to organize specific events for their beneficiaries, then they would potentially rely on some philanthropic resources. So the first step, analytical step that we engaged with, was this idea of saying, okay, we're interested in attention and, the ability of these organizations to maintain their attention on the two goals, the social and the commercial goal. So a first very important step was to try to analyze for each of the organization the attention patterns, meaning, for each organization, try to understand whether or not they were keeping their attention on the two goals, or maybe focusing on one goal only. And so we relied on the work of Willy Ocasio, who defined attention and how it shapes activities in organization. And we derived here a coding strategy looking at both what procedures and activities does the board monitor and what stakeholder relationship does the board prioritize. And so to do that coding, we went back to all the data collected through interviews, but also archival data with annual reports, excerpts from board meetings, etc., to understand how each of these 8 organizations were actually keeping their attention. And so what we did is that for each of them, we looked at what activities are monitored. Is it mainly social activities, mainly commercial, or is it both? And we looked at what stakeholders do they attend to, social stakeholders like other WISEs, the network of WISEs, there's regional and national networks, public partners that are very much also close to this world, or are they prioritizing their commercial partners, investors, potential shareholders around them? And so for each of these organizations, we did that thorough coding, which led us to formalize that final coding with 3 organizations, Green and Charity, being assessed as mainly focusing their attention on their social goals, while Busy Tech mainly focusing their attention on commercial goals, and 5 of these organizations managing to keep their attention on the 2 social and commercial goals. I will give you an example of an organization. It's this one, it's Green, and how that focus on the social goal played out in the life of the organization. So Green was founded by hardcore social workers, really people who were very active in their local community, in the local community center, and from that local community center had realized that unemployment was a big issue and that they really wanted to build something to try to address this. And so they created that organization, and recognizing themselves that they had no clue about what a company was about, but they felt like they really had to do it if they wanted to somehow solve the problem of unemployment in their region. And so they do that. They build the organization. It's difficult. They're struggling, but they manage over time to find support from their environment. They find an activity that for which they can generate resources, and things seem to be going in the right direction. And then one day the city comes to them and tells them, we have this campground. It's a city that was located near, a company located near La Rochelle. That's on the Atlantic Ocean in France. And they had this, the city had this old campground that they didn't know what to do with, and they asked Green, would you be interested in running this campground? This campground was really going nowhere, and these social activists on the board of Green started thinking, most of our employees at Green, they have housing issues. It would be great if we could actually use that camping as a way to get these people with at least temporary housing and help them transition back to normal housing. And so they really got into that activity because their focus was social. They really wanted their employees, social employees, to have housing. They felt like it was a big issue for them to find work, and that was what they decided to do. They had no clue about how to make that sustainable. And they didn't find a way to make this sustainable, because if the city was not able to make it sustainable, it's really because the operations in this campground were not economically viable. But nowhere in the transcripts of the board decisions with this project, and when I interviewed people, that question of to what extent is it financially viable? To what extent are we going to be able to make this a sustainable, economically sustainable operation? Was nowhere to be found. What happened is that it became a very major burden on the life of this organization. And for years they were running on a deficit because of that campground operation that they ended up having to close. But it really distracted the organization from its core goal, which was really putting emphasis on training the skills of work of these people. And it's really their minds being so concentrated on social mission, which is great, but without enough attention paid to, but what does this mean economically, that it put the organization in trouble, potentially at jeopardy. They were able to get out of it without dying, but it was really a big challenge. So that was the first step. A second, and here are some examples of how we coded. I'm going to go quickly through this, but so green we've already covered. Let me give you an example of an organization that was able to keep a focus on the two goals. So here we have SoCycle. In terms of procedures and activities, each year the board reviews key indicators, social indicators, are as important as commercial indicators, economic indicators, ensure our sustainability, social indicators, ensure that we achieve our mission. So at the board level, they had somehow theorized this notion of we need to keep our attention on these two goals, and we created the processes that enabled us to do so. In terms of relationship with stakeholders, in the same way, they were also very much recognizing the importance of being connected and reaching out both to social and commercial stakeholders. SoCycle sites owe their success to the support of local government agencies that contribute financially or that help our social integration mission. But SoCycle sites also owe it to the local commercial dynamic that they are able to build, and the recognition by local economic actors and clients of the value of our model. And so here is an example of an organization among the 5 that I cited that were able to keep their attention on both. And then, building on that first coding, we had to figure out, what may drive these differences. And here again, we rely on previous work that, says that logics channel attention to what is considered appropriate. And so we realized that it was very important to understand what are the logics that decision maker adhere to. And we focused on the board. We're talking here about rather small organizations, and the key decision makers were board members and executive director. And so this is what we coded. And here, so we went, and I won't bore you with the details of the methods, but they are described in the paper, where we were 3 of us conducting independently that coding, looking at the profile of all the members of the board and executive director, and categorize each of them as adhering to the social logic, or adhering to the commercial logic, or adhering to both. And here that coding is done at the board level. So green, for instance, is made of, green's board is made of these social activists that I was mentioning before. So all of them have a very similar profile of people very connected to the local community, very engaged, with professional experience, mostly in the social sector or in social work. And here, Busy Tech, that's an interesting example. It's a company that was created by young retirees from IBM. So they were all, executives from IBM who felt like they wanted to give back. They had experience in running a company and in technicalities, absolutely no experience in the social sector. And the board was made of mainly these actors, mainly adhering to the commercial logic. And with these 5 organizations, we have a combination of either individuals adhering to one logic, other adhering to the other one, or some individuals were also hybrids themselves. We have, and I have this nice quote of one of this hybrid individual who explained to me, he was the executive director of one of the WISEs. I graduated from a business school, a reference in the business world. It allows me to start discussion with business leaders. Conversely, when I meet people from the social sector who tell me you don't have a clue, you're not a social worker, I tell them it's okay, I graduated with a master in social work. So he had a master in social work, he did an executive MBA later on, so that individual we coded as representing the two logics. And so, these 2 analytical steps, having understood to what extent these organizations were able or not to keep their attention on the 2 goals, having looked at the profile and the degree to which logics were represented at the board level, we were able to make interesting findings. And I'm going to go over them. a first finding, not entirely surprising, but that is an important first step, led us to realize that the organizations that focused their attention on one goal only were also the organization for which the board were composed of individuals who were adhering to one logic only. And so we had this situation where a group of social workers were really, based on their experience, based on what they felt was important, were really focusing on social mission mainly, at times either forgetting about or not really being skilled or equipped to focus on the commercial goal. And when we had the IBM executives on the board, conversely, they were very much concerned about how can we make sure that we make this work commercially speaking, while not really being skilled or focusing their attention on the social goal. And so in contrast, these 5 other organizations who had boards composed of members adhering to both the social and the commercial logic were the organizations that were also able to focus their attention on the 2 goals. So that's the first step. You may say, that's not entirely surprising or not fully unexpected. Yet what was also very interesting is what we found is that these organizations with diverse boards were also more likely to experience what we defined as this really intense governance crisis, which were times during which at the board level members engaged in very intense conflict that lasted over months and that really led them to actually not focus on their social mission or their commercial goals anymore, but only focus internally on trying to find a solution to their internal conflict. So we found this conflict to be very distracting, and so we are observing that it may be a good idea to have a diverse board if you want to achieve your social and commercial goal, but you may run into serious troubles in terms of creating these situations where you have intense conflicts at the board level that will actually distract you from any of these 2 goals. Here we provide a bit more information about this crisis. So work services is an interesting example where when I was collecting the data there, the crisis was raging, and it was so obvious that everyone had only one thing on top of their mind was, how are we going to get out of this? How am I going to be able to convince the other of my truth? And so they were not even really that passionate talking to me about their social mission and their operations, because they were so full of this conflict. And that conflict came out because the executive director at some point said, we've been operating as a not-for-profit organization for a long time. I believe that we should now create a for-profit entity because it would make look like a more legitimate commercial actor. This individual was bringing to the table of the board some experience in the for-profits, in the commercial sector. He'd been working in the insurance industry for a while. And so he put that idea on the table, and that generated an intense debate at the board level with members on the board adhering to the social mission, perceiving this idea of operating as a for-profit very, very problematic and illegitimate. That's an example. We have another example here, SoCycle. They were operating a wide network of sites across France, and they were debating at the board level how should we coordinate this network of sites. And there were 2 views again opposed, one being put forward by the tenants of the social logic, the other by the tenants of the business logic. The tenants of the social logic saying, we're here with a social mission. The way to do this is to make sure that we give local sites with the autonomy and the ability to create that local democracy that is part of what the non-profit sector should be about. And you had people with the business, adhering to the business logic, commercial logic, saying, no, but we're having that one brand across all sides, so we want to make sure that everyone is actually on the same page. And so it's branches that we should create, and we should make sure that the national organization has control over whatever is happening in this side organization. And again, intense conflict, very strong interpersonal tensions, because people just didn't view the way in which they should operate in the same way. Each of them really taking for granted their own views and having a hard time understanding what the others were proposing. Quite interesting outcomes here in that case in Socycle. This crisis led to the dismissal of the two co-founders who were pushing for more commercial practices. And so at some point, this organization being a not-for-profit and having this democratic election process, they were voted out. And so they had to leave the organization, leaving it in the hands of the other actors present here. In that case, the conflict was a bit different. I won't have time to go into all the details, but again, very intense, very difficult, almost led the organization to bankrupt, yet the company was finally transformed into a co-op. The story here was that one of the key shareholder, which was a not-for-profit organization, resented the fact that the organization had become more and more commercial, and at some point decided to pull out and ask for an enormous amount of money for the shares that it held in the company. And so what they did was that all the employees of the company managed to repurchase the shares, but again, very intense, very dramatic, and making people totally lose sight of their core goals, focusing only on that issue. So here, these are quotes. So there were these tensions at the board level, very strong tensions within the board and with the executive team. The former chair of the board resigned. I had to step in and take the chair role because the house was on fire and it had to be rescued. That was told to me during an interview by the current chair, suggesting that the crisis had been raging for a while because we'd been already through a second term of a second chair to try to deal with this. And the executive director said the organization was paralyzed for months. Interestingly, yet, although 3 of these organizations experienced this intense governance crisis, 2 of them didn't. And so then we moved on to try to compare what was happening in this organization that were not happening in these ones, that may explain their ability to avoid this crisis despite their diverse boards. And so what we did was then went back to the data and looked at the data in a temporal fashion to try to understand in more details where do these crises come from, why are some WISEs able to avoid them, and really looking at the board level dynamics over time to try to get at the core of this crisis. And what we found was interesting pattern. So what you have here is for each of the 5 organizations with this diverse board, the coding of the representation of the logics on the board over time. And so what you see here, for instance, is that Work Service started as an organization with a board that was really mainly composed of people adhering to the social logic. Then, accidentally, they hired an executive director who had experience and training in the commercial sector, who then, made this board balanced, diverse, having social and commercial logics represented, Yet we called it as unbalanced because you had one actor representing the commercial logic, all the other ones representing the social logic. So there was a clear predominance of the social welfare logic as opposed to the commercial one. Yet interestingly, as the organization evolved, with that executive director being, commercially driven, he, over time, invited some of his friends or, professional relationships to join the board. Not in a mean way, not because he wanted to take over, just because it was the normal life of an organization. Some board members left, then people asked, who should we mobilize? And he said, well, I have that person. And then over time, what happened was that the two groups, social, representing the social group and the commercial group, became much more balanced. And so over time, the balance of power, became equal, enabling then this conflict to occur, because when one group was putting forward one idea, the other one, if the group didn't like the idea, was willing and able to push against it. And that's exactly what happened. That's the organization where this executive director said, let's create for-profit organizations let's transform into a for-profit organization. He had enough friends around him, feeling that it was a good idea, yet they were what they used to call in the organization the old guard, who were still there, the old social workers, who were really resenting that idea. And so they were really, they started to fight very hard to, to keep that proposal from being voted. And this is when the governance crisis occurred. And we find very similar patterns in these two other organizations where, Zero Waste started as a group that was already diverse, but where the social coalition was, more predominant. Then they realized that it was important to access to markets, but also to prove to their external stakeholders that they were serious about being commercial. They invited as shareholders two major capitalist groups, Veolia and De Richebourg, which were two urban services groups, as shareholders, minority shareholders, but shareholders. And so the structure of the board became more balanced in terms of having strong representatives of the social and the commercial groups. And the not-for-profit shareholders at some point became alienated. He felt like, I don't recognize myself in this group anymore, and I want to leave. And this is again when the crisis occurred. If we try to summarize, we analyze the emergence of this crisis in this organization with diverse boards as resulting from this interesting evolution where boards, at least in our sample, started with unbalanced representation of the logic. So you always had one group a bit more powerful than the other. Then, either strategic cooptation or random cooptation, just, as the life of an organization may evolve, led to the strengthening of the minority coalition over time, leading then to a balanced representation of the logics in the board, and where then, since people were really somehow viewing the world in different ways, where then, when they were having equal power, willing to fight to see their view prevail. And this is when the governance crisis emerged. And this is when the board also started to lose attention on any of the two social and commercial goals. And so what we did next was then to really focus on, but what's happening in these two organizations here that enabled them to avoid this? And what we found is that these two organizations were actually combining two interesting governance arrangements. First, what we observed was that, given the importance of this evolution of the composition of the board that I mentioned previously, what we found is that the two organizations that were able to avoid this crisis were organizations who had designed their governance structure in such a way that they had a very stable allocation of decision rights. two for-profit organizations who had set up in their bylaws and shareholder agreements structures that enabled one coalition to somehow maintain power. So the case of temp work, 58 ownership to founding social activists. So there were two older social workers who created that organization. And they very strategically built the board and the shareholding structure in such a way that them and a group of trusted friends who were really deeply caring about the social mission were keeping a majority ownership of the organization. But they invited a lot of business partners that they gave 40% of shares. Work & Co, it's a similar reverse situation where you have, it's an organization that was created by ADECO, which is this major temp work group, and they decided at some point to create a social integration branch. And so they, used to their model of full ownership, they created a for-profit entity that was dealing with all the social integration operations, yet ADECO remained 100% owner of that entity, so allowing ADECO to really maintain power. Interestingly, and so this seemed to avoid the situation that I described before with changes in the composition of the board, which may ultimately lead to conflict. Interestingly, yet, is the case of zero waste, because zero waste actually had a similar situation with a stable allocation of decision right, with 70% of ownership to this not-for-profit that was that initially founded the organization. Yet this didn't keep zero waste from experiencing that very severe crisis. And so what we found is that, in addition to this stable allocation of decision rights, what seemed to be needed to be able to avoid this conflict is this notion of integration mechanisms. So really initiatives taken by, in the cases that we have, either the chair or the executive director of the organization, to somehow bring together the people from the different coalitions on the board together, to allow them to understand each other, understand their perspective, and find a way somehow to reconcile their diverging views and work together to collaborate. And so it may take the form of regular interactions, it may take the form of site visits, it may take the form of more specific trainings that enable them not only to ensure that the allocation of share was stable, but that also the two coalitions on the board were understanding each other enough so that in situations where decisions need to be made, they're able to find agreements on this. And again, zero waste is interesting here because they had the stable allocation of decision rights, but they didn't have that. And so we had a situation where we had that nonprofit who was the main shareholder here, who never engaged in any discussion of any kind with the business partners that were the other owners, for different reasons, but they never interacted, and the business partners never really interacted with the founding nonprofit either, and so they didn't understand each other, and so it was not very surprising that over time they really felt estranged and they didn't feel like they had nothing to do with each other, and they had a hard time figuring out how they could work together. And that's why at some point the nonprofit said, I don't want to be associated with that anymore. This is not me. I want to leave. And this is what led then to this crisis. So these are the two factors that really emerged as important ones. I'm sure there are other factors. So type of funding, it's not clear because at the end, they are all somehow relying on similar business models with, 80% of their revenues from the contracts or the sales that they have, and the 20% coming from subsidies. at some point, there may be also individual factors coming in, like here the executive director in this organization, the executive director used to be the executive director of this not-for-profit. So he was initially executive director, then he became the executive director of the WISE that the not-for-profit created. And so was there some tension between the new executive director who viewed the executive director of the WISE as, I don't know, a competitor or someone that, I don't know. So there may be also individual reasons. What we propose here is that that's probably one driving factor, certainly not the only one. What we argue here is that as soon as the board becomes balanced, that's when the crisis happens. And what they're able to do is to keep their boards diverse yet unbalanced through the stable allocation of decision rights. And so this is really the dynamic that we believe is happening here. It's this notion of inviting multiple and diverse views on the board while avoiding situations where the two coalitions have equal power and are then able to somehow neutralize each other and this is when crises occur. And so the stable, if we go a bit deeper in the content of these mechanisms, what we find is that this notion of stable allocation of decision rights, which is either formalized in the bylaws or in the shareholders' agreement, grants the majority to one group, providing power stability despite co-optation, and ensuring that all voices are represented. So I wouldn't want this finding to come up as being manipulative with one dominant coalition trying to manipulate the lower, the smaller one. This is not what we are seeing, but what we are seeing is that it's both important that the two voices, the social and the commercial voices, are present, yet it's also important that they are not able to neutralize each other and that to some extent, some has the ability to somehow drive activities. And then back to your question on legal status, which is, I think, a very important one. The truth is that it's easier, at least in the French context, to define a stable allocation of decision right in a for-profit organization because it's a matter of how many shares do you own. And so for sure, not-for-profit organizations in France, especially given that context of this democratic governance, which is really at the essence of the association movement in France, makes it much more difficult. Yet I know from my own experience in the not-for-profit sector that it is actually possible in the French not-for-profit context to define bylaws in a not-for-profit context that allow you to do that, so to somehow monitor the presence of different groups at the board level and ensure that that stability can be maintained. So easier in the for-profit context, not impossible in the not-for-profit context, based on our understanding of the field. Integration mechanisms, what we find is that they're enacted by leaders, here executive director or chair, and they may take the form of formal interactions, so regular formal meetings, regular formal flow of information, as well as informal interactions. So we have here that interesting quote of the executive director of that organization founded by ADECO. So when our new chair got appointed, so the new chair was the Secretary General of ADECO, who became, technically that was written in the bylaw, he was the chair of the WISE created by ADECO. And so he said, when our new chair got appointed, I got in touch with his assistant to make sure that his first field trip be organized in a region where we have a local work and co site. So he knew that the Secretary General of ADECO doesn't have social integration high on his agenda and on his mind. And so he wanted to make sure that he would understand enough so that when important decisions would need to be taken, he would understand what they would be about. And so I made sure he met with a powerful, inspiring social leader that socialized him into this world. So he understood what a WISE was about and then decided to put that high on this agenda. So Here it was very strategic on the part of the executive director, but it was one of these mechanisms that we believe enabled to cultivate that mutual understanding between these two groups. And so, if we try to summarize these findings, what we propose here is that boards with multiple representation that, again, in our sample started all unbalanced, could experience co-optation of representatives of the minority coalition, yet stable allocation of decision right and integration mechanisms enabled that representation of logics at the board level to remain unbalanced, and then avoided crisis and enabled this board to maintain their attention on both social and commercial goals. I think what is important is that these integration mechanisms really have the goal to voice the views of one coalition to the other. And so what I mentioned, when I mentioned the case of this other organization where you had the executive director who was somehow going to talk with one and then going to talk with the other, he didn't convey the views of the other coalition to each of the group that he was visiting. And so he was mainly somehow keeping a very strong wall between the two, which led then to these people feeling that they had nothing to do together. And so I think some time is involved because understanding takes time. I don't think it needs to be, we go on vacation together to really become friends. That's not the idea. But the idea is really to socialize these members into the views of the others, and also probably understand that we're all here with the same motivation for the social goal, which is really at the end what I found is in this sector is that when I entered the field, I thought, maybe I will find people in this field that, especially in those who chose the for-profit legal status, maybe I'll find organizations that use this as a way to, collect some subsidies, but really with the goal to, to enrich themselves. To become richer or to distribute profits, because they are allowed to, in this context. Those that make profits, they can distribute profits to their shareholders. The truth is that they don't make that much profit because the fact that they rely on these employees who are really less productive than traditional employees would be makes it more difficult for them to make big profits. But at the end, so they were all really there for the social mission, and getting the opportunity for everyone to realize that was also probably an important part of the integration mechanism. So, you're from ADECO, but I spent some time with you, and I realized then that you really care about the mission, and that you're not here only because you want to do, social washing or whatever. And I'm really, reaching the end. So with the overall conclusion, I would say that governance arrangements matter a lot when it comes to, ensuring that social enterprises maintain their attention on both their social and their commercial mission. And there are very, clear implications from this work, which is then, if you are a social enterprise pursuing both a social and commercial mission, you're probably better off mobilizing on your board individuals who adhere to both the social and the commercial logic, either individually or, either in different people or in people who are somehow hybrid individuals themselves. Yet, if you want to avoid situations of conflict between these groups that will really see the world in different ways, you need to make sure that you create this, governance structure where you ensure that the allocation of decision right is stable, and you create these opportunities of interactions that really generate mutual understanding and willingness to work together. Then, this is only a first step, and there are obviously many, remaining questions. One in particular being this notion of, but how does then attention lead to governance, because keeping attention on both goals is a very important first step. But then the next step would be to say, then, how do you maximize on the achievement on your social goal and the achievement of your commercial goals? And that study is not able to speak to that. So I hope that in future work we'll be able to explore that question. And also another remaining question is, to what extent would this generalize to other contexts, other hybrid organizations that are not social enterprises? And that's also something that qualitative research does not allow us to do, but we believe that just as in universities, it's potentially interesting to have a combination of academic and non-academic people involved in the decision-making process. It probably holds in other contexts, but we cannot for sure make that conclusion. Their boards were then very homogeneous, so they were people who were really viewing the world in the same way, and so there may have been conflict as in any organization, but not the intense, distracting crisis that we found in the other one, which were really, and this is what fascinated me and that resonated with my own experience in my organization that I mentioned initially. These crises that they experienced were really driven by their understanding of, or by their taken for granted views of what was appropriate to do. So when they discussed should we operate as a for-profit or as a non-profit, there were no objective, rational assessment of this is the pros and the cons of that model and this is why we should. It was mainly about, is it legitimate or is it not? We are not a we are not here for the money, so why should we use a for-profit model? This is, this is just not the way it should be. So it was very much driven by this institutional, what we refer to here as institutional logics, but this really, taken for granted templates of what is perceived as being legitimate. And so this is why, we believe that, these crises, they're really specific to situations where you have on the board people who represent different logics, and that may then really deeply, strongly disagree about how to do things and how to achieve the goals that they set. I think the link to performance, and you will say, and Gary, who takes that issue seriously, which is a key one, which is how do you then measure performance in this. And the ability of these organizations to really generate social change in a positive way. But I think that we've now spent quite some time looking inside this organization, understanding the dynamics and understanding, how they manage to cope. Now is, I think, time to try to really get at the question of what may really enable them to be successful at achieving their mission. Are there specific internal configurations, specific context, specific dynamics that may allow them to do so. Myself, my next research program looks at individuals, precisely because I've seen that the way in which individual actors in this organization play an important role, and the degree to which they adhere to one logic or not strongly, depending on their experience, shapes in many ways the ability of these organizations to sustain their operations and succeed. And so I've been starting new research on how individuals, and in particular I'm interested in these hybrid individuals, because some of these, the people who play these integrative roles were individuals who were themselves hybrid. So they had been working in the business sector but had a long experience in the social sector. And my sense is that these individuals, they play a very important role in being able to bridge worlds, build partnerships, etc. And so I have this research project that looks at, why do some people become hybridizers when others compartmentalize their experiences or their skills. So that's, I think, another interesting avenue for research.
Well, that's a great question to end on. Let's think again.
Thank you all.